So to start, I want to really start to give people an idea of this, what's become known as the environmentalist movement, and what it actually represents. Because what you have with the British Empire is they effectively have two paths that they are potentially willing to take the world down. The one path is what Phil had presented, which is to, if there's a failure in their mind on the part of Russia, China, and others to capitulate and bow to their imperial intention, then they're willing to go all the way to nuclear war. To say, if we cannot stay in control, we would rather see the entire human race go extinct than to lose our tradition. Right? People have heard the old adage, there are those who would rather roll in hell than serve in heaven. And that's the kind of mentality you have with the oligarchical principle. They would rather roll in hell, bring about the extinction of mankind, than to see another system come about that would supplant them, to remove them. And so on the one hand, they are willing to go to that level of thermonuclear war. Now on the flip side, they would prefer not to go to that level. They prefer to stay in power and rule as they traditionally have. Now the model for that is really what's become known as environmentalism, what's become known as population control, population reduction, resource management, the ecology movement. These are actually just different names and manifestations of what is the oligarchical tradition, the anti-humanist tradition. And I do want to give people a very clear idea of that so that there can be no room for loose interpretation of exactly what the idea of the environmental movement is at its core. You know, despite what might be some decent intentions on many proponents of environmentalism, you know, to have clean water, clean air, the forests, these kinds of things, of course, we all want those. And we actually have a policy that would bring that about in abundance within the WAPA project. So if you are actually concerned about those things, get behind the WAPA. That's the way you have more water, more rain, clean air, more forests, more food, and more people. Now, but the real core of the environmentalist movement, the intention is population reduction. The intention is to move humanity backwards to really a dark age type of condition, a feudalistic condition. And that's what you have represented by Obama. All this building up of the windmills, the solar panels, you know, the idea that that's going to be that's going to be the thing that saves the economy. And I'll mention this and I'll get at it a little bit later. There are a couple of reports that have been recently issued by two leading, I don't know if you call them think tanks, or really mouthpieces for the oligarchical system. The Royal Society and the other is the Club of Rome. Have both issued very large reports which give a picture of where they would like to take the world. And I'll reference them a little bit later, but for example, the Club of Rome one, it's titled 2052, and it's based off the idea that we're now 40 years after the issuance of their first major work, which was Limits to Growth, which said if we continue down this path of industrialization, technological advance, population growth, we will reach a point where we will deplete our resources so far that it will bring about a kind of biological holocaust. And the point is, we were right, look at where we are, look at the famine, look at the level of poverty, look at the unemployment, etc., etc., etc. Now they don't mention the fact that it was actually the policy recommendations that they put forward 40 years ago, which in fact are the cause of those problems. But now they're issuing another report called 2052 to say, okay, in the next 40 years, where are we going to be? And they paint a very bleak picture of what the future will be if, again, we don't move full force with their kind of, with their environmentalist policies, ecology policies. But so I'd like to get into a bit more of what actually that tradition is. And then we'll present the other side, the actual science, the real science of the biosphere, the real science of life. and the real science of the relationship of man to life. So let me just start by reading a quote which really pinpoints the coming into fruition of the environmentalist movement. And it actually started with Zeus. You'll see Zeus, in fact, was the first environmentalist. People, if you're not familiar, you may have heard, the battle between Zeus and Prometheus. Right? Prometheus is the one who took from the gods fire and gave it to man. But if you read Aeschylus's account, the remaining of the Prometheus trilogy, the one that does remain, really what that meant was it was science, it was poetry, it was astronomy, it was language. Really what Prometheus represented was the man coming into his own as a creative being. Man discovering language, discovering his power to navigate with the stars. And Zeus, who represented the imperial order, Zeus, who represented the oligarchical class, who saw themselves as gods to roll over the rest of mankind, was furious with Prometheus. So much so that he condemned him to be chained to a rock to have his liver eaten out on a daily basis by a vulture or something of that sort. That was he was condemned to that forever. So what the story represents is really that battle between the oligarchical tradition and the humanist tradition. Now you'll see why I say, though, really, that tradition, the anti-humanist tradition, really was the tradition of environmentalism. And that Zeus was, in fact, the first environmentalist. And so this is just a short quote from a poem called Cypria, and it was written in the 6th century BC. What it says: "There was a time when the countless tribes of men, though wide dispersed, oppressed the surface of the deep-bosomed earth. And Zeus saw it and had pity, and in his wise heart resolved to relieve the all-nurturing earth of men by causing the great struggle, the Ilian War, that the load of death might empty the world. So the heroes were slain in Troy, and the plan of Zeus came to pass." So you see, out of his concern for the deep-bosomed earth, Zeus put man on a course of destruction through war and what have you. And that actually does capture the essence of what the environmentalist movement actually is. In the name of saving the earth, the idea is to depopulate the earth, to rid the earth of numerous numbers of man, such that it can be a much more controllable population. I mean, just to make the point on how the oligarchical thinking works. And this is something which becomes clearer, really, once you start to get sort of the other side, the positive side of what Lyndon LaRouche has developed in his discoveries of physical economy, which is that, and the oligarchy has a certain, I don't know if you'd call it an intuitive sense of this. They don't really have a creative understanding of it, but they do have an intuitive sense that as populations grow, you require certain things, more food to support more people. You need more development to support more people. In order to do that, it means you have to have more people who are educated. You have to introduce technologies. More of your population has to understand how the universe works, how the world works. Now, the more that people have that kind of understanding of the universe around them, an understanding of the relationship of their mind, of their ability to discover principles, the less they're going to be willing to bow down and capitulate to an oligarchical system. They're not going to go along with being enslaved. They're not going to go along with being herded like cattle. And so the oligarchy has always known that when you have growing populations with flourishing technology and classical culture, that's a population which they can't control. That's a population which will not succumb to their imperial order. And so they've always had a policy of keeping the population low, stupid, and controllable. Keep just enough people around to, carry their bags and chauffeur them, and grow the food and do the necessary toil that is required to maintain their lifestyle. But don't let them get too numerous, because then you run into problems. Then people start getting uppity and thinking they can do things for themselves. And that's really what you have with, that's why they've always had this policy of limited population. Now, just to fast forward a bit, I want to look at one of the figures who really embodies this idea, which is a figure by the name of Bertrand Russell. Now, this is someone who Lyndon LaRouche himself had deemed at one point to be the most evil man of the 20th century. And I think through a couple of these quotes, you'll get a sense of why he might say that. Now, Russell himself was one of the leading figures of what became known as the Fabian movement in England. It has other names and manifestations. But effectively what it was the ruling class of financial elite, policymakers, etc., that really were coming into their own during World War I, coming out of World War I, who were looking to reestablish the British Empire to maintain really the British Empire as the dominant force on the planet. And to them it required sort of pushing aside maybe older traditions and moving with certain newer kind of traditions or manifestations of the imperial system. And so Russell is one of the leading figures of this movement. And he's someone whose grandfather, Lord Russell, John Russell, I believe his name was actually one of the principal backers of the Confederacy in the United States, out of London. Not everybody is aware that actually the Confederate movement was wholly a London-backed movement. That the intention of the Confederacy was to split the Union and to make the United States susceptible to being taken over again by the British Empire. And the slave system, despite the lie that, oh, the British actually were the first civilized ones to liberate the slaves, and here we were backwards in America still trying to hold on to this system. Well, the reason why they were, quote unquote, able to liberate the slaves in England was because they were living off the system of slavery in the United States. The idea that you would have a slave system in the South that would grow cotton, the raw materials, send it over to Britain to be manufactured, and then sent back to the United States for sale. I mean, it was the free trade system. And Britain wholly backed it with the ultimate intention of destroying the United States. And one of the principal organizers of that, figures in England who was really behind the Confederacy, was Lord John Russell, the grandfather of Bertrand Russell. And so here is, I won't read all these quotes, but just enough to give you a sense of who this man is. Well, we'll skip down to the second one here. This first one's just a racist diatribe on his part about, all the different colored races taking over the white races, and the fact we have to do something about that. But here he says, bad times, you may say, are exceptional and can be dealt with by exceptional methods. This has been more or less true during the honeymoon period of industrialism, but it will not remain true unless the increase of population can be enormously diminished. At present, the population of the world is increasing at about 58,000 per diem. War, so far, has had no very great effect on this increase, which continued through each of the world wars. War has hitherto been disappointing in this respect. But perhaps bacteriological war may prove more effective. If a Black Death could spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. The state of affairs might be somewhat unpleasant, but what of it? Really high-minded people are indifferent to the happiness, especially other people's. Now, this is also why, coming out of World War II, prior to our gaining knowledge that the Soviets had themselves developed a thermonuclear weapon, Russell himself had called for a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union, where with nuclear weapons, now maybe we do have an effective war tool for population control. I'll just skip this second quote, which is, this is this is a Q&A back and forth that gets at that, where they basically ask him, is it true that you had advocated the use of bombing the Soviet Union or Russia with nuclear weapons? And he says, yeah, at the time I thought it was a pretty good idea. But here, this one then gives you more of a sense of kind of the mentality of this oligarchical class, where again Russell says, when I first became politically conscious, Gladstone and Disraeli still confronted each other amid Victorian solitudes, and the British Empire seemed eternal. A threat to British naval supremacy was unthinkable. The country was aristocratic, rich, and growing richer. For an old man with such a background, it is difficult to feel at home in a world of American supremacy. And this is the mindset coming out of World War II, was that you had, because of the industrial buildup, because of the efforts of Roosevelt, and really because of the revival of the American system, which really was, though the form wasn't wholly of the American credit system, really the intent was that, which was the idea of generating long-term credit to build up your industrial power based off of an idea of a future intention. And so you had this buildup of all kinds of industrial might in the United States, technological revolution after revolution, to the point where coming out of World War II, the U.S. was really the most dominant force on the planet. And I think, I may have my figures wrong, but I think it counted for something like half of the actual industrial export in the entire planet. That was the United States coming out of World War II. And the intention of Roosevelt, and this is something he really butted heads with Churchill on, the intention of Roosevelt was to take this massive industrial war machine that was built up and in fact retool it to now become the producer of, instead of tanks, things like tractors. Instead of warplanes, planes for fertilization or other good deeds. The idea that the United States would then take this industrial buildup and use it to rebuild the planet and to free continents such as Africa from imperial rule. Roosevelt was emphatic about the idea that we could green the deserts in Africa. He was somewhat obsessed with maps, and he used to look at all these kinds of maps of Africa and whatnot. And he knew where there used to be all these old rivers and had an idea of where there once was water and what the landscape must have been like. And he really had this grand vision that we could now, after having defeated fascism, and now that the British were backed into a corner because of the might of the United States, we could liberate once and for all the planet of imperial rule and start to do things like green the deserts in Africa, to feed everybody, to liberate the Middle East from this kind of, pitting each against the other type of policy of the British. And so that was the kind of thing that people like Russell hated. And so what they started to attack and go after was exactly the thing that made that possible. They went after technology. They went after industry. They went after the idea that you could transform the planet for the better. And so they took the idea of what was an imperial policy, and you'll see in another quote, which was actually also a very racial policy, and they just sort of repackaged it and renamed it, and it became the ecology movement, environmentalist movement, what have you. And the whole idea was, well, the big challenge we're going to have is that as all this industry grows, population's going to grow, we're going to outstrip our resources, etc., etc. And so it was a policy of evil. Now let me just turn to another figure so that you can get a sense of exactly how this worked. And this is now a quote from Sir Julian Huxley, who was the guy who created UNESCO, which is the United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organization. People may have heard of UNESCO. It's a wing of the United Nations. Well, here's what Sir Julian had to say. And this is actually in the founding document of UNESCO. He says, thus, even though it is quite true that any radical eugenic policy will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible,
it will be important for UNESCO to see that the public mind is informed of the issue at stake, so that much that now is unthinkable may at least become thinkable. So again, he says the public mind, and this is referring to, like he said here, eugenics. Right? Eugenics policy will be, for many years, politically and psychologically impossible. It will be important for UNESCO to see that the public mind is informed of the issue at stake, such that much that is now unthinkable may at least become thinkable.
And that's Julian Huxley. The idea that these, eugenics, which had unfortunately gotten such a bad name under this radical Hitler, but which we all know is a very necessary and real science, which we must again bring back to the fore. That part of the intention of UNESCO, right, the Organization on Science and Culture, is to bring back into the minds of the population the ideas of eugenics, population control, race control. And now, Julian Huxley was the guy who helped to found what became the ecology movement in Britain, along with another guy named Arthur Tansley. Now this is something, I think most people here have heard of the term ecosystem, right? And most people think ecosystem must be, it just means an environment. It's like another word for environment or something. But the actual origin of ecosystem comes from this guy, Arthur Tansley. Now Arthur Tansley was again another British aristocrat. And he had some kind of weird dream that he shot his wife. And so he was freaked out about this dream, so he went to visit Sigmund Freud to get some help in interpreting this dream, because he thought he might end up doing it one day or something. And so he had a number of talks with Freud, and Freud kind of helped him out or whatever, and told him, really, you didn't shoot your wife, you really just want to sleep with your mother, and whatever. So I guess he was satisfied with that. But in the course of this discussion, what Freud did is he told him of his own ideas about how he thought the brain worked. And Freud had this idea, which, there's some slight science to back it up, but really his idea was that the whole functioning of the brain and the mind was just a big electrical network. That really all the brain is this interconnected network of electrical circuits, and that's what produces, as an epiphenomena, our idea of mind. So Tansley kind of grabbed onto this idea and said, oh, well, gee, maybe all of life is like that. And so he generated this conception that all of life is really just this very complex network of circuitry, of electrical circuitry and feedback loops. Which makes sense if you think about who he is and what he came out of. See, Tansley was also a follower of the very same guy that we quoted here, Bertrand Russell. He came out of Russell's networks in Oxford. The other side of what Russell had been doing, aside from, he was kind of this half-assed philosopher, he was a bad scientist, he had all kinds of weird ideas, but he also was involved in a kind of mathematics, which was really logical systems. And he wrote a book, Principia Mathematica, with another guy, Whitehead. The intention of this book was to, in effect, reduce all science, all possible knowledge, to one closed logical system. To say that we can create a language of logic where everything is logically consistent and interconnected, such that anything that could ever be thought of in the future, and all that's ever been thought up to this point, all truth, all knowledge, will be contained and be able to be deduced from this one closed system. Now, that then became the foundation for what we then called cybernetics, and the whole idea of feedback loops and feedback systems, and really what's at the foundation of today's computer movement. It was a certain kind of psychosis on his part to think that you could do this. To think that you could reduce the human mind down to simply a set of interconnected feedback loops and logical interactions. A purely logically deductive system. Now, this is something that along came another guy, Kurt Gödel, who was a kind of mathematician, who, in the language of logic, actually proved that no logical system could actually ever be fully consistent. And in effect, what Gödel did was to show that there is always something which can exist outside of the system for which the system cannot account. And he did it actually in the language of logic, which was really a slap in the face to these guys, that their own system sort of proved their theory about the system to be wrong. Now what Gödel was doing in effect was, he was operating in the tradition of something which we trace back, at least in modern times, to a guy named Nicholas of Cusa. And even before that to Plato and those networks. One of the things that Nicholas of Cusa did, among many things, such as creating the idea of the sovereign nation state and effectively launching the movement that led to the founding of America, what Cusa did was that one of the things he's known for is presenting, in effect, the discovery of the transcendental. And he did this through looking at what's known as the inability to square the circle, so to speak. And unfortunately I don't have an image of it, but maybe people can think of it. That if you have an idea of a circle, and what's sort of the fundamental idea of a circle? Right? It has no sides, it's constant change, it has no angles, so it has a certain characteristic to it, actually a self-defined identity. Now think of that versus a square. Right? A square has 4 sides, 4 corners. Then you can go from, say, a square to an octagon. So you're increasing the sides, increasing the corners. Then you can go up higher to a 16-sided figure, double that to a 32-sided figure. And you can keep going with that process up till, whatever, a million-sided figure, which has 1,000,000 edges and 1,000,000 vertices. And in effect, you could keep doing that to 1 billion, trillion, what have you. What Cusa proved was that no matter how many sides, no matter how much you increase that, though it will tend to look more and more like a circle, because and this is really like your computer, when your computer draws a circle, it doesn't actually draw a real circle. It doesn't produce something with constant curvature. It's producing a polygon with many, many sides, but which the eye cannot distinguish from a circle. So it's this it might be a 1,000,000-sided polygon or something. What Cusa demonstrated was that no matter how many sides you have, it will never actually be a circle. That the circle has a transcendental relationship to the polygon, in a sense that the circle is of a higher order. Right? You could generate any polygon from a circle through certain foldings and whatnot of the circle. But you could never get to the circle from the polygon, no matter how many sides you add to it. So for him, it was an expression of the way that actually the creative mind works. That a new creative discovery, a new idea, has a certain transcendental relationship to any previous body of knowledge. That, say, Einstein's discovery of relativity, just to take an example. You could never get to it through some kind of simple logical deduction from the existing knowledge. And Einstein is actually very clear about this, and maybe Phil will get into some of that. But you can never say, okay, give me all the knowledge that exists right now, that humanity has access to, all the information or whatever, and somehow I can actually deduce from that what the next creative discovery is going to be. It's an impossibility. Because any act of true creation, a real creative insight, a real creative discovery, is something which exists outside of any current body of knowledge. That's what makes it an actual creative discovery. You're actually bringing into existence, into the mind of man, into human culture, an idea which otherwise never existed and never could exist within the framework of the existing current body of knowledge. And so it's like what you have with this idea of the relationship between the polygon and the circle. Now, no matter how much you extrapolate this process of just adding sides and sides and sides and sides and sides, you're never going to get from a polygon to a circle. The circle is, in a sense, of a higher order than the polygon and exists outside of the polygon. And that's the way the creative human mind works. So what Russell did and this whole movement by saying that somehow you could reduce all knowledge down to one fixed formal system, you were in effect trying to eliminate creativity from the process. You're trying to say that creativity doesn't exist. All that exists is logical deduction. Now, once you do that, you end up with the kind of insanity you have today with the whole movement towards artificial intelligence. To say that, well, since the mind is really just, and all human knowledge is really just a logical system of deduction, and since computers, that's how computer systems work, and computers actually can do it much faster, and can do many more calculations per interval of time than any human mind, seemingly, well then ultimately you will reach a point where computers, as the ultimate logical calculating systems, will surpass human thought, will become better than human beings, because they'll do it faster, they'll do more of it, what have you. But of course the assumption is that there isn't this thing called creativity. The assumption is that there's not something which is outside of logic. And that's actually what you have. That's the problem with this whole idea of cybernetics, of artificial intelligence, and that really was the problem of someone like Bertrand Russell. He denied the idea of mankind. He denied the unique characteristic of humanity. And in fact, as we saw with this guy, the fact that it was Tansley, a student of Russell, who actually created the idea of ecosystems based off of that very same idea, that you could model the entire process of life on Earth as just a logically deductive interconnected system. That actually became the mathematical foundation for things like the limits to growth that was produced by this guy Forrester. You know, the limits to growth was produced by J. Forrester and I forget the first, Meadows, I forget his first name. But Forrester, he himself was in a sense, a student of Tansley's. And Forrester, whenever he heard that the Club of Rome wanted to pull together some kind of model of what was happening with life, with the environment, he offered his services because his background was in computer systems, in feedback systems, feedback loops, etc. And really this is what started the trend of this biological modeling, where you could set up certain parameters within a computer system, where you get certain feedback loops, and you know, when this resource gets used to this much, it kicks back and it triggers some change over here, and you know, it gets very complicated, and it's very interconnected, and you know, they'll say it's dynamic. But really, all it is a fixed logical system which denies creativity in life. And then what they do is they just run their system based off of whatever fixed parameters they plug in and say, oh, we can tell the future based off of these fixed parameters. But it will take certain assumptions like there won't be any change in technology and will forever always just depend on, say, oil. And so we just keep, you know, shows that maybe we're doubling the use of oil every 10 years or something. So as that goes, we're eventually going to reach this breakdown point in our ability to get fuel, or in our use of trees, or water, or what have you. And so then they'll run these models, denying creativity, denying technological advance, and then say, well, based off of this, this is where we're headed. We're headed for doom. We're headed for destruction. And the only way that we can stop that is if we pull back on industry. If we don't allow the third world to develop. Because if there's more people in Africa and they're developing technologies, well, they're going to start using up these resources, which really are we're rightfully entitled to. Which is really what's in something like Henry Kissinger's National Security Memorandum 200, where he says very explicitly, if the third world is allowed to develop, they're going to consume the resources that we of the West are the rightful owners of. And so therefore, we have to have a policy intentionally of limited population and limited development so that we can hold on to these resources. And so they have a certain kind of trick, which is that though technology would in fact be the way that you would overcome any kind of, you know, what would be certain, you do run into certain limits on resources. the way you overcome that would actually be through technological advance. Like, say, moving from an oil-based economy to a nuclear-based economy. But since their intention isn't actually about conserving resources, since their intention isn't actually about developing the environment, since their intention is actually about reducing population and controlling humanity, they take that out of the equation. They say creativity is not allowed, technological advance is not allowed. All that's allowed is this bleak forecast of the future that we present based off of these computer models. And therefore, you then have to accept our policy of how to remedy this, which is a policy of zero growth, population reduction. And now, in fact, that is, again, the thrust of policy which the British Empire is now again putting forward as, for them, the new system which must emerge out of what they do recognize as a currently collapsing economy. Now, just to get a sense of that, you know, despite what you might see in the popular media about a recovery and whatnot, right, if you lose your job, that's actually signs that the economy is recovering in their logic. Or if you've been out of work for so long that you give up on looking for a job, that's actually good for the economy because that magically lowers unemployment. Once you're unemployed so long, you're no longer technically counted as unemployed, so that actually shows as an increase or a drop in the unemployment level. But you'll see, they actually do recognize the depth of the crisis, that there is a collapse of the system, which is why they're pushing this other agenda. And they say, this is some excerpts from the new Club of Rome book, this 2052. They say, within the first decade of this millennium, humanity already finds itself in at least 5 major ecological and social crises. Each of them is a warning sign that something is going wrong. An unemployment crisis, that's true. A food crisis, undeniable. A global financial crisis, yes. An economic crisis, and a global ecological crisis. So they acknowledge we're in the throes of a real breakdown, right? And so they'll admit within, sort of their elite publications and among certain circles of the elite, they'll acknowledge, yes, we're in this crisis. And they say these individual crises are in fact driven by many of the same root causes. Values not aligned with the crises we are facing, and an antiquated belief system, such as a belief that everybody's entitled to, say, an education or health care or food. An outdated economy, outdated institutions, such as the nation state, and inadequate delivery mechanisms. So on the one hand, they acknowledge, at least among certain layers, we are in a crisis. But what they put forward as the solution is exactly the same kind of population reduction, limit consumption. We've got to cap CO2. How do you cap CO2? Stop industry. What's the effect of stopping industry? You have lack of development. People die. You don't have water. So they acknowledge it, and this is in fact what you've had as the core of the ideology driving the Obama administration. If you look at what actually was the intention of his healthcare policy, it really was what we were saying. I mean, it's sort of the light term that was given to it was rationing of healthcare. Actually, what it was a willful policy of killing people off through denying them of healthcare. If you look at the policy of, the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens, the expansion of the Patriot Act, all of this to increase then the police state conditions, because they know chaos is going to break out. When people start facing long-term unemployment, can't get water, can't get food, you do have chaos does ensue. So you got to make sure you have a nice police state in place to control that. You have things like the policy he's had on, the economic policy of rationing. There's the whole thing, these books that were written by these behavioral economists. They're talking about how do you sort of encourage, or when they use the term, nudge people to make better choices, to not want to consume as much. to not, to not demand so much health care? How do you encourage people that once they get old that they should just sort of give up the ghost early and not use up the resources for the next generation? All these things. It's all been a part of this policy of moving towards this idea of limit and restrict consumption, all in the name of saving the planet. But really, it's all in the name of limiting population and creating a new system of control by the empire. So they know the current system's gone. They know they're never going to get back to the size of the kind of banking structure and whatnot that we have now. So the idea is to move towards one where they all sort of vulturize each other, they cannibalize each other, shrink it all down to a much more controllable system that will then replace the dying one now, but replace it in the name of environmentalism, ecology, what have you. Now just to put the edge on this thing, and this is a point that becomes clearer and clearer, what we've demonstrated time and time again with our work, our scientific work and our movement, is that there is a lawful connection, as I've said, between population growth and technology, science. That as you introduce new principles of science into your economy, you create the ability to produce more resources, greater abundances of energy, grow more food, and thereby support more people at ever higher standards of living. I mean, this is one of the core ideas at the heart of Lynn's own discoveries in economics. And if you look at just the history curve of population growth, population explosions have always corresponded to technological revolutions. Things like the Industrial Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution. So science has always been the thing that drives population growth. And so if you're a promoter of science, of true science, you're inherently going to be a promoter of population growth. That being the case, wouldn't it seem odd to have as your science advisor someone who's against population growth? If the promotion of true science leads to population growth, what kind of science advisor would you be if you were actually against population growth? Would that tend to be a science advisor who would actually advise you on proper scientific policy? It would actually have an intention to expand science? Well, that's in fact what you have with Obama. His scientific advisor is this guy, John Holdren. Now, John Holdren is someone who co-wrote numerous papers with another guy named Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich is the guy who wrote the book, The Population Bomb, that discussed the fact that population explosion was the thing that was going to, again, like much of this stuff, was going to lead us down the road to destruction. And in fact, one of the essays that this guy, John Holdren, co-wrote with Paul Ehrlich actually called for the putting of chemicals into the drinking water that would sterilize people. That you would force sterilization on the population by putting chemicals into the drinking water. That's the science advisor of Barack Obama. Now, once he was confirmed, he said, oh, well, I don't believe in that anymore. But he, more recently, he wrote a paper in 1995 with that same Ehrlich, where he said he called for, quote, a world of zero net growth and, quote, population limitation. That's the science advisor, saying we can't have growth, we have to limit the population. Now that same science advisor, his buddy Ehrlich, he more recently said this, quote, how many people you support depends on lifestyles. We came up with a 1.5 to 2 billion figure because you can have big active cities and wilderness. So the figure they came up with is that we could support 1 to 2 billion people in total on the planet. We currently have 7. So you do the math. What's the intention? They say, if you want a battery chicken world where everyone has minimal space and food and everyone is kept just about alive, you might be able to support in the long term about 4 or 5 billion. But you already have 7 billion. So we have to humanely
and as rapidly as possible, move to population shrinkage. As rapidly as possible, move to population shrinkage. That's Paul Ehrlich. That's the guy who co-wrote numerous papers with the current science advisor to Barack Obama. And people say it's radical whenever we say that there's an intention on his part to shut down NASA. That whenever he pushes things like the healthcare bill, it's intended to kill people, to depopulate the population. Whenever he shuts down the satellites that would give us early warnings for things like earthquakes and floods, we say, no, that's intentional. That's being done to create conditions for chaos and death. People say, oh, that's radical. Who would ever think that? That sounds evil. He's not evil, is he? But you see exactly. Right? He's evil, but he's not dumb. So when he appointed this man to be his science advisor, to advise him on what to do about healthcare, to what to do about NASA, what to do about the satellites, he knew exactly what kind of figure he was bringing into his cabinet. And it typifies exactly the kind of genocidal mentality that you have with this current president. Which is why we're saying you really do have to wrap your mind around that. That you're not just dealing with an asshole in the White House or something. You're dealing with a figure of evil in the White House who is committed to a policy of oligarchism, of population reduction. And who, as Phil pointed out, because of his just humongous ego and his just out-of-control personality, is willing to push this thing all the way, again, also, to the brink of thermonuclear war. That's the ugly face of things. Let me just maybe quickly give people the other side, which is actually the real science that we've been working on, which gives people an actual idea of what the real principle of life is, how life actually exists in our universe. So let's run through a couple of images that depict this. Okay, so this is something many people may have seen. This is a kind of heuristic device which shows the characteristic of growth of the biosphere. If people aren't familiar with the term, the biosphere was a term that was developed by a man named Vladimir Vernadsky, a Russian biogeochemist, who really started to look at life as a single system, but looking at what's the characteristic of that system, what's the actual dynamics of that system. And so what you see here is a growth function of sorts, where you have these different cones, which are in a sense nested within each other. So you have like a skinnier cone, nested within it, and then be a wider one, nested within it will be an even wider one, and it produces this one function, this kind of horn, this growing horn function. Each of those cones represent a different era of life on the planet. So like the Paleozoic would represent one cone, an even wider cone would be the Mesozoic, and then the next widest one would be the Cenozoic. Each one of those can be thought of as a different system, a different quality of the system of life on the planet. So that each one of those systems has a characteristic of different types of living organisms. Now, just to focus in on, say, the one that's, well, people can see it, but here this thing says the KT extinction, which is that line that splits, that runs into what says the Cenozoic. The KT extinction it demarcates the shift from the Mesozoic to the Cenozoic, from the Cretaceous to the Tertiary. What the KT extinction was, this is the one that most people are familiar with. This is the dying out, the extinction of the dinosaurs. That system, that Mesozoic system, was one which the dominant life form or animal form was large dinosaurs. And you had certain dominant plant forms, flora, which was things like ferns, other types of gymnosperms, which are non-flowering, non-seeding plants. And so you had a certain system. It had a certain, you could look at it in terms of the amount of energy throughput that's moving through the entire biosphere per unit of time, in terms of the metabolism of the animals, the rate of photosynthesis that's going on by the plants, the rate at which
food is being eaten, digested, or one thing Vernadsky looked at, what he called the biogenic flow of materials, which is looking at, if you just look at sort of the periodic table, all the different elements of the periodic table, what's the rate at which the elements are moving through living processes? Like right now, everyone here is engaged in a process of moving material through the biosphere, right? Through respiration, through, eating, going to the bathroom, all this kind of stuff, right? There's constantly material moving through your body, every breath you take, everything. And so the rate at which that's occurring, he would measure that as the rate of flow of material through so if you took all of life, what's the rate at which material is flowing through a living process? And he showed that, okay, under one system, the Mesozoic, there's a certain rate of flow of material through the system. So it has a certain flux density of energy. Then you have this extinction point, where much of the life which characterized that previous system, when extinct, was wiped out, and was then replaced by a higher order form of life, the mammals. Mammals have a much higher metabolism than dinosaurs. Mammals require about 10 times as much food to maintain the same body weight as a dinosaur. So a dinosaur of any one of your size would only require about 1/10 the amount of food that you require, because you have to do things like maintain a constant body temperature. Right? That's what it is to be warm-blooded. So you're using more fuel, so to speak. Now, mammals have other advantages. With hair and with the higher metabolism are able to exist in much different climates. Right? Mammals can live all the way up to the North Pole with polar bears, as everyone's so infatuated with nowadays, down to the equator. Whereas dinosaurs and reptiles are very limited in the band where they can live. Right? Reptiles, being cold-blooded, can only exist in warmer temperatures. So with the coming into existence of what we might classify as the mammal system, life was engaged in more energetic activity. It was becoming more abundant. It could live in more diverse types of climates. The thing that enabled that partly to occur was that you also had a revolution in the plant life. You had a shift from the gymnosperms, what are known as the angiosperms. Angiosperms are plants that have things like flowers and fruits, nuts. Now, what's the advantage of that? There you're dealing with something where through photosynthesis, you're actually concentrating energy in a much more dense way than you have with, just say, leafy ferns or something. So that now you have in fruits, like an apple, you have a very concentrated amount of energy, which then a mammal can consume to fuel this much more active lifestyle, this much higher metabolism. And so you have this overall shift in the entire system, in both the plant life, the animal life. Also, for example, at virtually the same instant that flowering plants came into existence, bees came into existence. Right? Bees are very necessary for the pollination process. And so you have the whole system shifts towards a higher energy level. It's more energetic, it's more dynamic, it's more diverse. And so this is what Vernadsky was looking at, was that life as a whole is not just this process of random mutation. Right? The Darwinian notion of evolution is a total fraud. The idea that life just, a mutation occurs for some random reason and things change, and under the Darwinian system, really there isn't actual change. It's just things are different, but it's not really change. It would just be random, and one era versus another you couldn't really qualify them as saying, well, one is higher or lower, it's just different. What Vernadsky actually demonstrated is that it's not just a difference, a random change, it's actually development. That life as a whole on the planet is actually moving towards an increase in energy throughput. It's becoming more complex, more diverse. That there's actually a creative intention which is governing the development of life on the planet. That life is governed by something which we might characterize as mind. Not that any one of the creatures necessarily has a willful mind. Right? It's not like the dinosaurs decided to sort of step aside and let the mammals take charge. or a dinosaur decided to sort of mutate itself into a higher form. But that the system as a whole is governed by something which has a directionality to it, which is moving towards a future which is always more developed, more organized, like we see in human history, like the move from a feudal system to the nation state, from the move from subsistence farming to more developed farming systems, what have you. That it's always moving towards increasing the power of life to exist and exert itself on the planet. Now, what Vernadsky hinted at, and which we've done more work on and stuff is coming out, is that this is not something which is just then a planetary phenomenon. It's actually something which is a manifestation of something occurring on a galactic level. That the transformation of life on the planet is actually a reflection of galactic changes, of an evolution of the entire galaxy. And you see that in this, if you just pay attention to, say, to the left side here, where we're looking at this 60 million year cycle, which is the movement of the planet up and down through the plane of the galaxy. So you have the galaxy, which is some sort of spiral galaxy with maybe 2, maybe 4 arms. That's still being debated. But our solar system moves around along the outside edge of the galaxy, moves around it every, I think to get the whole way through it takes something like, I don't know, say 350 million years roughly or so. But as it's moving around the edge, it's also bobbing up and down. And so the 60 million year cycle is the cycle, the number of years it takes for it to go from, say, the northern peak down through the plane, down to the southern peak, and back up to the northern peak again. So it's a 60 million year cycle, or you can think of it as like a sine wave. Now what has been compiled here, if you look at the top one, people can read that red one, it says biodiversity. And what this shows is that the diversity of life, in terms of the number of different genera of life, and this is looking at in the oceans, itself goes through a cycle of rise and fall every 60 million years. So there's a certain cycle in the rise and fall of life on the planet connected to this much larger galactic cycle. So there's some relationship to the galactic process and certain changes, in this case biodiversity, on life. Now other terrestrial phenomena are also changing with this. The green one is rate of sedimentation. So that's the rate at which sediment is building up on the sea floor. The next one is continental freeboard. That's the kind of upwelling of magma and the growth of the continental shelf. That's also occurring along the 60 million year cycle. And the bottom one shows you have something corresponding to the 60 million year cycle associated with volcanism, the rate at which volcanoes are occurring. So from life to all kinds of other tectonic and other terrestrial phenomena, all of these, at least in this section, are connected to this 60 million year cycle. Now we've done work to demonstrate that there's a certain common link of sorts in all of these, which is the role of something which is still being worked out and is little understood, but which is the role of changes on a galactic scale which correspond to changes in cosmic radiation levels. Changes in the amount and type of electromagnetic radiation which is impinging on the Earth, coming from sources such as supernova events like the Crab Nebula. And so there's something with the change in the electromagnetic environment which corresponds with changes in all kinds of other phenomena on Earth, like tectonic activity, volcanism, and life changes, but which are occurring as a function of changes on a galactic level. And so you have a similar kind of thing with the 140 million year cycle, where you get it looking at changes in the cosmic radiation flux and how that corresponds with things like ice ages and other events. The point being is that what we experience as these long cycles of changes and development on Earth are in fact connected to something which is occurring on a much grander scale, on a galactic scale. And as our previous image indicates, this isn't then just some kind of cyclical change. Though you have these cyclical changes, the overall trend if you look at life itself as an overall trend, is actually one of anti-entropic development. So you actually see life expressing a development process as a function of some kind of overall galactic or extragalactic change. So that in fact, at minimum, the galaxy, and really I think it's a universal process, the universe as a whole is going through a process of evolution, of development. Right? It's not like it's put forward with the second law of thermodynamics, that we just live in this entropic universe which is winding down, and eventually it's all going to become this cold, dead zone, that the universe will eventually reach the heat death point. But in fact, the characteristic of the universe as a whole, as reflected in life on Earth, is one of development, of creative change, of growth. And that in fact, that also has to be the characteristic of human economies. That tradition, the trajectory has been, if you look at, here you've got something similar to the cone that we saw with the animal systems. Now you're looking at it from the standpoint of human economy, where you're looking at changes from different types of fuel sources, from wood to coal, from coal to petroleum, from petroleum to uranium, nuclear processes. Then ultimately, something which we should have developed by now, which is fusion with the deuterium, and then finally matter-antimatter reactions. But what you should notice is the characteristic of the ones we know did happen, like the revolution from wood to coal. It took about 400,000 years. But what that meant was that, and here this right column here, this kilowatt hours per pound, that tells you how many kilowatt hours of energy can you generate for a pound of that particular material. So for a pound of wood, you get 1.9 kilowatt hours. A pound of coal gives you 3.8, so a near doubling. A pound of oil, petroleum, gives you 6.4. So again, a near doubling, or two-thirds, or whatever, 2/5 or something. So what you're seeing is that with each successive revolution, which comes about as the introduction of some new technology, a discovery in some new chemical process, some insight on the part of man about how material exists and how it can be used, increases in the power of man to express itself on a planetary scale, to bring about change, to what Lyndon LaRouche discusses as an increase in energy flux density. How much energy can you bring to bear per unit of time and space? Now, your ability to increase that density isn't just a quantitative increase, it's actually qualitative. Like, for example, certain kinds of smelting processes, or certain kind, the production of extracting iron from certain ores. The rate and ability to do that is a function of, say, heat. How hot can you get your coal furnace? Now, the temperature, the ability to heat that up, the temperatures you can achieve are going to be a function of the energy flux density of the material you're using. So, for example, you could, the quality of ore that you could use, say, with wood-fired plants is the quality of ore, you have to use a much higher grade of ore to extract and to produce steel than, say, what you could use with, say, a coal-fired one. With a coal-fired one, you can use much lower grade ore, it's much cheaper to get, and you can do things with it that you couldn't achieve with the lower order process. It becomes even more extreme whenever you move into the domain of like uranium, like nuclear processes, or fusion processes, where you can actually start to transform material itself. A process known as transmutation, where you can actually take a certain substance, a certain chemical, and actually transform it into a different one. You can create new chemicals. You can create new ores. And so each one of these successive jumps in energy flux density aren't just an increase, just a quantitative increase in energy. It's actually a qualitative change. You can do things that were otherwise impossible by the introduction of the new technologies, which themselves are the fruits of discovery on the part of mankind's mind. And so you see the rate at which this has occurred has always been increasing. The danger is this. With this green movement, we've put the brakes on this process. We've said, no, we're going to shut down nuclear power. We're not going to invest in fusion. As we've seen with this recent budget from Obama, they've cut the funding for fusion research and the fusion facilities by like 2/3 or something. We're going to be reduced down to having only one federally funded facility which is doing fusion research. So by doing this, we're halting scientific progress. And in fact, we're condemning ourselves to one fixed type of system. Now, by condemning ourselves to one fixed type of system, we're actually condemning ourselves to the same kind of future which any animal has experienced within its own system, such as the dinosaurs. Right? The dinosaurs went extinct because as the entire biosphere, as the universe changed, as the universe developed, the dinosaurs were not equipped to meet the standards of that change. So the dinosaurs went extinct, and what came about was a higher form of animal life which was able to meet the demands of the changing system, which were in a sense tuned to the process of growth, tuned to the anti-entropic function of the system as a whole. Mankind has been unique in this respect, because unlike any animal, mankind has actually been responsible for willfully changing his activity, for willfully evolving through new ideas, willfully evolving through creative discovery to higher orders of existence. Or in effect, mankind mirrors the process of development of the universe and actually drives the process of development. But once man stops doing that, once man stops acting as man, stops acting as what is unique about man, which is to act creatively, we actually become susceptible to the same fate that has befallen all animals who were themselves not consciously creative. And we are threatened with actual extinction. And that's what we face now. By adopting this policy of zero growth, by adopting a culture which intentionally destroys the creative capacity of humanity, by turning our back on nuclear power and fusion development, we're actually willfully, which is the real tragedy of it, we're actually willfully condemning ourselves to an extinction. But if we're able to remove this pestilence, Obama, and actually install something like Glass-Steagall, move towards the credit system, and then start to fund things like NWAPA, which you can find out more about if you don't know, the big water development project that would create 6 million jobs immediately. And we've got reports in the back that people can purchase. We move towards NWAPA as part of that process of really what has to be sort of the long-term immediate goal, which is colonization, Mars colonization, which would force us to do things like develop fusion-powered rockets for one-gravity acceleration, would move us into the domain of matter-antimatter reactions, which we know how to do, but which we're not looking into. If we adopt that mission and move forward, then we continue the growth process. We actually take up what is the actual intention of man's existence, which is to participate in the creative development of the universe as a whole. But with man, it's willful. We have to choose to act as humanity. To fail to do that would then to choose extinction. To do that would be to really take up what is our divine right, which is to participate in the creative process. To actually, in a real sense, sit at the right hand of the Father and participate in the creative development of the universe and humanity. So those are the choices that we have before us. And it really is up to us and everyone here to take up that fight and do the first step, which is remove Obama, clear the path towards this kind of future progress. So I'll just end with that, and I don't know if it takes a couple questions. If there are any, then Phil has some more. Yeah.
You know, I'm 73 years old, so I've been through a little bit of history. This thing that you were talking about, Russell.
Yeah.
Well, they had a big lie going on, you know, some years back, you know, so that he was the most peaceful person in the world. There could be nobody more peaceful than this man. I mean, he was for growth and everything, you know, I mean, and I fell into that right there, you know. I'm going to admit, you know, I fell into that, and I figured out, well, after this experience, you know, says, I won't let this happen again, you know. I'm right now looking at Judy Chu, Congressman Judy Chu, doctor in psychology. Yeah, she went into the Obama cabinet, not exactly the cabinet. The person that went in the cabinet was Secretary of Labor, Solis.
Right, yeah.
Who was also my congresswoman too, before that. She really didn't create that many jobs, you know, when she was there.
Yeah.
But now, the thing about it, Judy Chu has decided to come in, you know, says, and talk about, she just put the Glass-Steagall Act in the back. As a matter of fact, we have it in one of the leaflets that was given today, that she's still the holdout, you know. We have a letter which states that she says that it's not the right time to go for Glass-Steagall right now. This was about a month ago, you know. But yet at the same time, she admitted to me, you know, that she was very patriotic, you know, because of her father, you know, was a veteran of the war.
Yeah.
And then she turns out, you know, with this thing about supporting Obama, you know, telling me she's going to support Obama, you know, so that's why she's running for Congress. At that time when she told me that, there was a popularity about getting Obama in, you know, so, and now I've been demonstrating against her, but not so directly, you know, says, I mean, by directly, I mean, you know, putting on a mass demonstration or something like this. Because she's got to the point, you know, says, where her idea is to go over and do some more brainwashing.
You know, look, what we've been saying is that, I mean, one, we have been encouraging people to call these congressmen and tell them they've got to go for Glass-Steagall. Now, this is the thing, is that, one, as Phil pointed out, were Glass-Steagall to be brought to a vote and to pass, Obama, by instinct, would be forced to veto it, threaten to veto it. By doing that, it would put a certain spotlight on him into exactly what his intention is. For anyone who wasn't clear up to this point, I think that would make it glaringly obvious exactly who he is, who he works for, and what his intention is. And so by pushing someone like Judy Chu and all these other Congress people to get behind and support Glass-Steagall, that's in effect a way that they can make amends with their illegitimate support for Obama up to this point. And now the other side, though, is to recognize that people are fearful. Many of them are actually fearful for their lives to go against Obama. You know, as we've discussed, and some of the stuff has come up in these Ulsterman reports, that, you know, a number of bodies have turned up as a result of, you know, either their betrayal of Obama or knowing too much or what have you. That is sheer cowardice. I mean, with someone like Judy Chu, I think that's part of why the organizing is so important, is that you make them more fearful of the population and what the population will do to move them out of office, to defame their name and expose them to what they actually are. Make them more afraid of that than they are of going against Obama and going against what they perceive as popular opinion, or the popular line of the Democratic Party.
See, one of the things is that she says that she's not for the war. She's not into that.
Yeah.
But she already had a history with this going around and praising her dad not in service, you know, military service. But,
let me get this next question here. But we can talk about that, though.
Okay.
It's important. So you had a question?
Where does the Catholic Church fit in? I have several questions. Where does the Catholic Church fit into your, description of how the rise of population? I always thought they were a catalyst for the rise of population, and that they are part of the network of the oligarchy. And poverty is also been scientifically linked with overpopulation. That as we improve the quality of life, population tends to stabilize, whereas when we keep areas impoverished, population tends to explode. And how does that fit into what you're describing?
Yeah, I mean, on the Catholic thing, I mean, it's sort of a mixed bag. There's been some good Catholics, some bad ones, and I mean, where they are now is sort of a...
Well, I mean, the Catholic Church as an entity is a very organized system.
Yeah,
that
sure.
Has, you know, a very high power structure, and I am under the understanding it's tied into the oligarchy we're talking about.
Well, I mean, it has been, but also at other times, people like the guy I mentioned earlier, Nicholas of Cusa, he was a Catholic cardinal, but he was also responsible for leading a certain fight against the Venetian oligarchy of his time, and was very much responsible for launching the movement for the founding of the United States, for America. And so it's, you know, you've had all kinds of battles.
Well, I'm not talking about the Vatican. I'm talking about the structure at the top, which has had a agenda of, you know, multiply.
Yeah, I mean,
multiply.
yeah, I mean, it has been pro-popular, but I mean, it's also a mixed bag. Some of these things become just dogma. But I think more important, though, is what you brought up, the second point about the relationship of poverty to population. I mean, it is the case that as you have more educated, developed societies, people tend to, you know, per capita, have less children. But the thing is, you actually have a policy now of reducing population by killing off existing children. And that's really what's at the heart of the crisis, is that you have literally tens of millions of existing children who will never be able to have any children because they are immediately being threatened with starvation, with death through, you know, curable diseases like malaria, you know, diphtheria, things like that. Now, that's an intentional policy, to impose poverty in such a way, to impose conditions of life whose intention is to kill off massive numbers of the population. So you're going to have, so if you have real technological growth and development, you're going to have a corresponding population growth overall. But it's going to be a population growth which is continuously raised to an ever higher standard of living, because you're going to be constantly introducing new technologies and new abilities to support people, healthcare-wise, food-wise, energy-wise, what have you. I mean, that's actually been one of the things at the core of Mr. LaRouche's own discovery in economics, which gets at this whole thing of an increase in energy flux density. That every time you introduce a new technology into the economy, you actually make the cost of production of the existing market basket cheaper, and thereby you free up more labor and more available resource to then be invested in new conditions of living standard, like new technologies, new transportation systems, things like NWAPA. And so it's actually the case that through a process of constant introduction of technology and principles into the economy, you're always increasing not just population, but increasing population such that each person has an ever-increasing standard of living, an ever-increasing opportunity themselves to contribute to the ongoing creative process. And so there's actually a way you have healthy, lawful population growth, but in a way which doesn't actually lead to more poverty. It actually comes out of a poverty reduction policy, which is things like we're promoting, like the advances in technology, fusion, nuclear power, NWAPA, what have you.
I would love to see this room full of people. I think you have many wonderful points that you bring up. I live in Santa Barbara, and every time I bring up the conversation at LaRouche, I get a pretty negative response. There's a pretty strong
opposition.
Opinion people have come to.
Yeah,
right?
a mustache that does it.
And I'm also an environmentalist, and you make a great point that we all would like clean water, we'd like clean air, and so I don't think that it serves you to paint environmentalism as evil. We could all wrap our mind around eugenics is something that we do not support, right? But the idea when is that you, in my opinion, you close minds when you just jump right in to making the equation environmentalism as evil.
But the environmental movement was created with the intention to reduce population and impose an oligarchical system.
And you can create that point, in my opinion, I'm just giving you my reflection. You can create that point by not jumping to the judgmental statement about it being evil. It's full of many, many good-minded people who have very many good-minded goals about.
Well, this is why we encourage people to get behind things like the Nawapa Project.
Having a mercury-free world, having clean air that their kids can breathe, all these different things. And I would encourage you not to close their minds by opening your conversation with going into the painting of
the intention is to actually open their mind to the reality behind what drives many of the intentions of the environmental movement.
I know.
When people talk about...
I'm asking you to hear me.
I hear you. I mean, trust me, I've talked to you 1,000 times. I mean, not you specifically, but I mean, I've talked to people who are like, why are you saying this? I don't hate people. I love children. It's like, yes, that's true. And like I said earlier, I'm not saying that every person who says, I like clean water and fresh air is a genocidalist. What I'm saying is that the core foundational beliefs that are behind what would be called environmentalism are actual evil policies. Because the intention is to reduce the population and to do it in the name of conservation and resource management.
Well,
to do it in the name of species.
I'm asking you.
You don't get what she's saying.
I get what you're saying. You call yourself an environmentalist, and so when I say the word environmental and say that it's evil, you personally feel offended.
No,
she's talking about her people. She's trying to present your viewpoint to other people that are close to
I am a huge contributor to your organization. All right?
Yeah.
I am interested in you being effective.
Yes.
Right.
Okay? And my opinion is that you don't want to close minds. And so when you make the equation of us environmentalists who want clean air and clean water as being evil, that's an association you don't want to make.
But I thought I was pretty clear in not making that association.
No, you're not.
So you now think...
You kind of like moon people. Like, it's like... I'm not saying you in particular, but I've read the stuff and I've also contributed on and off the past for 25 years. When a lot of these, there is this arrogance that comes across, and it's the arrogance that comes from some kind of discipline and some kind of training. I'm not saying that it's not present, but you can take a page out of Dale Carnegie's book. Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And what you really want to do, and this is my opinion, what we all want to do is to turn people around who are doing things or being led to believe that the things that they're contributing to are harming their own agenda. And if you won't get people to stop and take notice unless you allow them to go through the mental matriculation process in their own mind to where they can come to their own conclusions.
I have
enough evidence.
I have no problem with that.
But what is happening, and she's saying that the technique that she's seen demonstrated repeatedly over and over and over again is this snobbishness that will not allow that as the LaRouche organization presents their information, and which is a lot of it is very, very valid, that a lot of people get turned off and they have this cement wall built up against them because they
I've been organizing for 12 years in the field, so I know what you're saying. But I'm saying you also have to differentiate between people who don't want to hear anything that might go against what they perceive as their own personal opinion and actual truth. You can't hide the truth from people because it might offend them.
And they call it flaming news. And so what you can do is you can plant seeds. You can remind them that this happens and this happens, and then later on, maybe a day later or a week later, they'll put two and two together.
Well, that happens all the time. That's occurring now, which is why more and more people are saying, hey, I supported Obama full-heartedly 3 years ago. Now I see the guy's a crooked killer. I mean, and these are people who, I mean, we have many people who are strong supporters of ours who wouldn't talk to us for years because of our attacks on Obama, but now because we stayed true to that principle, they're now coming back saying, you know what, I'm glad you stuck with it because this man is truly evil.
But, you know, you hear about this on talk radio all the time, that there's a freak-out factor. And if people really knew what a bomb was about, if they knew what was going on in God's country or man's country or whatever in Chicago, if people had, they would completely freak out. And what's happened is
they should freak out.
Yeah, they should freak out. But you don't want them freaking out against you. And that's what happens because these people are in the mind control that you're talking about.
I know, but all I would say, I hear what you're saying, but all I would say is you've got to be careful too, that you don't get sucked into the con of watering down the truth, because the belief that popular opinion ultimately is what has to be the holy, the God that you vow to. That you can't do things that would offend people.
I'm not talking about running a popularity contest.
Yeah,
I'm not talking about that. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I'm just.
No, we can talk more afterwards. We can talk. Let's take another question. Yeah. She had her hand up for quite a while. Ma'am? Yeah.
All right. One of the things that I could do, I could say, is that when you make the distinction between the movement that the oligarchic people are doing and the actual another movement which says, there's something wrong about the way we treat the environment, then you could probably resolve that issue if you make that distinction between the two. And I think that is maybe, if that's what's going on, then fine. Nobody can misunderstand, and you don't get hung up on words and different things, because that's nothing but a distraction. Okay, so if you make that distinction, then that's fine. All right, between what the oligarchy is doing environmentally and what other people are doing truly to protect the environment. Because you can also tell these people that for years and years and years, the oligarchy never cared. They thought nothing of damaging any environment to get to the oil or to get to whatever they wanted to do. But I know if you make that distinction between the two, there won't be any misunderstanding. Now, about the Catholic Church, I came up Catholic. I went through the whole gamut. I almost became a nun at one time. What they do is they have their policy where you can't even practice birth control because they wanted with the oligarchy to have enough people out here so that they could, work the fields or work wherever they want. Now all of a sudden they're shutting up because the oligarchy says, let's get rid of the population. So now they're going along with the flow. They know how to shut up and they know how to come forward. They're very manipulative like that. Okay, that is one of the things that the Catholic Church does. They're very philosophy against control. And it's another thing of suppressing women and keeping them so that they can continue to get that stuff, okay? To continue to get births when they want. And when they don't want it, then they shut up, step back, and let the genocide go down. All right? That is one of the things the Catholic Church is definitely guilty of, and they're partly of it. My question now I have is this. Is anybody making it clear or working on how the mind works, to show how it's been being manipulated, that keeps people in fear, that keeps whole populations frozen, where people don't want to be motivated? Because, they've been told straight out, we're going to kill you. So, the language of the streets is, hey, we're going to get you before you get us. But there are too many people that are just literally frozen. So what I would like to know is there anything that's being done to help people to understand why this mentality exists? Because that's where the real war starts. And that's
that's a lot of, that's been one of the, I can say a couple of different things. One, that's been one of probably the central investigation of Lynn himself is what is the characteristic of the creative human mind?
Yeah, there's a subliminal thing going on. That's a suspicion. That's keeping people just uptight and fearful where they don't want to say, wait a minute. They're scared to say themselves.
Yeah. But this is something that, if you just take sort of the more immediate period, right. If you look at what occurred really during the period of the 1960s, right. With the various assassinations of Kennedy, right. Both Kennedys, right. King, Malcolm X even, right? You had a condition and then what you have with the Vietnam War, where there was actually an intentional kind of shock trauma induced in the population.
Yeah, and I know 2001, 9/11 was one also.
Yeah, and the fact that I think, for example, with the Kennedy assassination, I think it was very clear to most people who were thinking that there was something very fishy about the story that was officially being put forward about the single shooter, what have you, what have you. Now what happened though was the fact that then the population, by and large, went along with it. That was the first step towards this kind of psychological conditioning of basically saying, we're going to do this. It's going to be pretty obvious that this is a cover-up and not what it is. But to the extent the population goes along with it, that's really the first large capitulation on the part of the population en masse to go along with something which I think many people intuitively knew was evil, was crooked.
I know that they know how to manipulate people like crazy. They're masters at it. So
but the flip side to it is this, though. Let me just say this one other thing, is that the flip side of how it also was then able to continue was then by shutting down things like the space program, by not presenting people with a sense of an optimistic future, by imposing this idea which became the end of history, right? We've reached the end of history, we've reached the end of progress. People no longer have a real sense of immortality, in that they are participating with their lives in a future which is going to be even greater than the one that they're currently experiencing. By robbing people of that kind of a vision of the future, that's the worst kind of mind control. Because then people get reduced down to a sense of, I've got to think about my life, I've got to think about my personal circumstance, I've got to go along to get along, I've got to think about my comfort, my pleasures, whatever. Because I don't have any idea of the future. And it's just been getting worse, to the point now where you look at what young children now have no concept of the future, no concept of optimism. It's pure it's just pure, really, barbarism in the streets. So the way you combat is the kind of thing we're doing, by presenting people with Nawapa, by giving people a real, in a sense, a tangible sense of their own immortality. Saying you could be part of something which is an immortal development of mankind. Your life will have eternal meaning. Not in some sense your name will be written in the history books or whatever. That itself is fleeting. But in the sense that what you've done with your life will have an eternal impact on the creative development of mankind, and correspondingly on the creative development of the universe as a whole. A real living immortality. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the best way, is you give, optimism is a great combatant of brainwashing and everything else we've been seeing. Oh yes.
I just wanted to say, some of the earlier discussion, I think what really touches a lot of people, especially people that are older, that we knew that there was a need for an environmental movement because of the pollution, way before there was an environmental movement, and to say that it was formed for the purpose of eugenics or something like this is completely different from saying that it was hijacked. Exactly what I was going to say. The hijacked by the oligarchy for their own purposes. And I think a key example is, a while back there was a chemical that was put into the gasoline. They made it so it had to be put in the gasoline in California. And the idea was it was supposed to clean the air, but it actually polluted the water. It was horrible. It was expensive. And this is a case where an oligarchy sees that they can consolidate power and put it into fewer refineries, and they can put a lot of refineries out of business and so on. And so they co-opt the environmental movement, the Sierra Club and so on, to go along with this crazy plan. And that's an example where it was hijacked. But that, to me, is you're going to have a lot more response, favorable response from people, rather than to say...
If you say that, rather than saying
that it was for a purpose, because it had a legitimate purpose. There is a...
Well, the idea of an ecosystem in the ecology movement by name was actually founded by an oligarchical grouping.
There is no difference between ecosystem and biosphere. They're the same thing. They're two words for the same thing.
Sure, but people have to actually know what they're talking about. We're part of the environment.
And we don't want to breathe dirty air and all the rest of it. And if we're taking care of ourselves. That's
sort of an enlightened pro-human approach, where the whole, environment is a part of the
Right, the idea that we're here to dominate the earth and conquer the earth and subdue the earth and all this other business, that's that ancient Christian idea.
We do subdue the earth. We make it better.
What is the statement?
We can increase the amount of life on the planet. I mean, to me, at a certain point, it becomes too obvious. Like, okay, people who are environmentalists, let's say, you know, just they're environmentalists from the standpoint they like life, they like living things, they like the living process. Yeah, why not? What mankind can do is actually increase the amount of that. We can actually bring more life to the planet.
Oh, I totally agree.
And we can actually, more fundamentally, we can actually bring more life to the entire solar system in the galaxy. I mean,
Okay, I'm with you completely. I'm just
You know,
saying,
the
don't
sad
put
thing
off
about it
on
is the oligarchy interferes with everything. It does, it interferes with everything.
Let's give
Let's
other
get the
people a
questions.
chance. Just ask questions.
You mentioned about President Obama and all the darkness about what he's doing. I think we should just step one step further and look at this as a global globalization and global. I don't want to call it really government. It's part of that. And truly, even if we are to remove Mr. Obama from the office, the other is going to be the same. What is happening that the only hope is in the hands of American people. We have to truly come together and not only change America, inspire the world, because what is happening is major powerful organizations or corporations are creating global government. And if you look at global government agenda, I shouldn't call it government, global institution. If you look at their agenda, you can hardly hear people's voice there. It's all these corporations, and they are talking about population, talking about development together, development of technology together. Before addressing truly space weapons, space energy, mind control, everything else is not going to work. It's cosmetic. People are being, now slavery is back. You mentioned about slavery.
Yes.
People are mind controlled.
That's the free trade system.
Space weapons. Congressman Dennis Kucinich in 2000, he proposed bills to regulate space weapons, but it did not go through. I am proposing that, and because of my background, I'm highly technical engineer. I've studied quantum physics and nanotechnology. This, I can engineer a device which will show a human cell who's exposed to this radiation than the other. Many people on welfare, many people on disability are under this. How can we even talk about any other issue?
well, because what we're saying is that we're facing the actual near-term extinction of all of humanity through thermonuclear war. I mean, think about what that would mean. We're talking about the kind of war that would not only kill all existing life on the planet, but it might actually, through the kind of damage it would create for the ionosphere and things like that, might actually destroy the potential for life to ever exist on the planet again. That's the actual kind of threat we're facing right now because of Obama.
Yes, we should not put our focus on Obama or this or that. Then we lose the whole picture. We have to look
I know, but
at
you have to, at a certain point, you have to recognize that by moving for impeachment of Obama, that would be the greatest catalyst for overall change that you could ever bring about.
The next person will do the same.
Well, not necessarily, because to realize this, to remove Obama would require a fundamental shift in the population and in the institutions of government, such that whoever would come in his stead would, one, recognize the kind of mobilization and threat that the population represents in getting rid of him. But two, you've now created the conditions where the population is now remoralized with the sense that, hey, we can do things, we can change things. And what we're already talking about is that it's not just get rid of Obama. You follow it up then with things like the Glass-Steagall, the credit system, the WAPA, that right on the heels of it, you've now got the momentum to move forward with this agenda for development. You know, this real humanist development agenda. And so, but if you don't go for Obama now and get rid of him, it's, as Phil made very clear, you've now got the Russians, the Prime Minister of Russia, saying we're moving towards thermonuclear war. It doesn't get any clearer than that. And it's very clear that Obama's the one who's leading that drive. It's his policies, which have, I mean, even under Bush, no one even came out and said anything as dramatic as this.
Yes, and I truly admire your going to the dinosaur exploration of extinction of dinosaurs, and somehow driving into that universe has a goal, universe is conscious. I didn't know this until I studied quantum physics. I was very much bought into Newtonian physics and Fourier and all of them, but then I moved away. In order to support your analysis, I would say that dinosaurs have become so, they were selfish, stupid beings that they were only consuming the earth. No other species was able to evolve because they were so giant, they were eating everything around. And a comet comes and destroys them. This is according to science. In my opinion, the universe looks at this and says, this is getting in our way. Let's get rid of this species. And that happened, and planet Earth replenished itself, and we were able to evolve. So it's going to be the same if right now we take the same conduct of dinosaurs being selfish, being ridiculous in our way, and not to see that we are all one. We should not anymore think of the idea of the survival of the fetus.
No, that's the idea, is that we actually, that's the point, that was the main point, is that we live in a process of a creative developing universe.
Yes, in a way, but in a way, we human beings have our nature is based on cooperation and mutual aid, not on vicious competitions. And if we do that, we will certainly have the same consequences of dinosaurs.
Yeah, that's for sure. Why don't we, Phil, you want to wrap it up? So he's going to, time remaining, Phil's going to actually take up perhaps some things on quantum physics and whatnot.
Well, probably not be able to take up all of this, but let me back up what Cody was saying. On the one hand, what we're losing sight of is the fact that the creative powers of the human mind, organized to make discoveries, to be truly creative, which is the only thing that makes us different. Everything else amounts to nothing. Sense perception, the animal capabilities that we have, don't distinguish us from the chimpanzee. What distinguishes us from other species is that we're capable of grasping universal principles that we do not experience as sense perception. In fact, I would say, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with British empiricism, or Paolo Sarpi's operation amongst the new Venetians against the Renaissance. And what was the Renaissance? I mean, look, in human history, ironically enough, there's only been a few points where there's been the dominance of the identity of the human being as a creative individual. The Greek Renaissance for a short period of time, the Italian Renaissance, the German classical period, the American Revolution. If you want to know where we should look to see what we have to do with the United States, look at the American Revolution. We broke from British monetarism. We broke from the British Empire. We defeated them when they shouldn't have been defeated. They were the greatest power in the world. Now, the American Constitution is based on the idea of the future for us and our posterity. That we're supposed to create a better and better future for the future citizens of the United States. That stands against the idea of monetarism and empiricism. What does empiricism say? All you can know is what you see, feel, touch, and hear. what you personally experience. All great discoveries, by definition, are things that you never experienced. If you experienced it, if it's within the language, and then it's already known. All deductive systems simply reproduce what's already been known and deduce it. Human creativity creates ideas that were previously unknown, that there was no experience of. And it's the human mind that makes those scientific discoveries. And that's the essence of the problem with environmentalism. Environmentalism, whether it's well-intended, I want to clean air, I'll tell you, the one thing I will contradict, I don't mind dirty air if it's on the way to human progress, human development. The Chinese have a pollution problem. They're about to clean it up. But the pollution problem was part of their becoming an industrial nation. There's a famous instance of the New York Times in the 1890s being against electricity. This is true, 1890 something. Because the electricity was going to scare the horses. And the horses were going to make a bigger mess. Now the idea that we wouldn't need horses never occurred to them. Part of the problem that we face is we have human beings trapped within a system which says that the only thing you can know is what you personally experience or personally observe or see, feel, touch, and hear. And the human mind is lost. People are afraid of the human mind. Environmentalism wasn't hijacked by the oligarchs. People were hijacked by the oligarchs. They said, you're wasting things. If you try to improve the living standards of people, if you have too many people, you're going to pollute the planet. What has been the actual truth of the matter? The slight moments of scientific progress have cleaned the atmosphere up. Let's take California, let's take Los Angeles, where this stuff is completely nutty. I mean, California may be the mecca of nuttiness, except for the state of Washington. Was the Los Angeles city and county sits in a bowl, which is surrounded by a series of mountains, the San Gabriel Mountains and so forth. And people, of course, have talked about the massive pollution of the smog and so on and so forth. What was this area like before we had heavy populations and industry? It was polluted because the bowl contained much of the fire and burning of wood that was used by the Native Americans. And so it was famous for being the valley of smoke. The way we clean up the environment is by more efficient, more technologically advanced, more energy dense forms of energy, so that you can take something with an energy flux density that you didn't have before and refine it and use it in a more efficient way. It's a little bit like a knife. You take a flat piece of metal, you can't cut a piece of bread or a piece of meat. You focus the energy by sharpening the knife or the piece of stone, and you can cut something. The human mind has the capability of solving these problems. What do we have in the 20th century? The 20th century is a lost century of pessimism. Not the sort of final point of it was the assassination of Kennedy, his brother, Martin Luther King. Look, Earth Day was funded by Shell Oil Company. This is what happened in the student movement. The student movement was a lunatic mess to begin with. It was pro-drug, pro-counterculture. It wasn't really anti-war. But by 1970, 71, they had run out of ways to manipulate the youth population, and they came up with Earth Day, which is a reaction to all forms of prior scientific and economic development. It was anti-FDR. It was anti-human development. But this idea of pessimism, which dominated the 20th century and really destroyed scientific development. What was it? World War I, the British Empire. After the American Civil War, the American system of industrial development was becoming the hegemonic direction on a global scale. And I mean this concretely. For example, in Russia, you had Mendeleev, Sergei Witte, later Vernadsky. They were followers of the American Revolution, and in particular, they were followers of what happened after the Civil War, when the United States was becoming the greatest industrial power in the world, agro-industrial power in the world. This was picked up by the Russians. It was picked up by the Chinese. Sun Yat-sen, by the early part of the 20th century, wrote a book called the International Development of China. It was a map of canals, railroads, ports for the interdevelopment of China. Sun Yat-sen was taught by American missionaries out of Hawaii, who themselves were tied to people earlier like John Quincy Adams, Lincoln, E. Peshine Smith, and so forth. In Germany, Bismarck was turned from a free trade patrician into a proponent of the American system, who worked directly with Henry Carey, who was the advisor to Abraham Lincoln on economic policy. So you had, on a global scale, the rise to dominance of the American system, which was going to clean everything up. Electricity cleans things up. Nuclear power cleans things up. The cleanest form of energy we've got is nuclear power. And whatever problems there are with fission can be solved with fusion. But we've lost the sense of economic, scientific, and technological progress. So what did the British do? Prince Albert, Edward VII, took upon himself, while his mother, Queen Victoria, was having an affair with the guy who ran the horses for the monarchy. It's a true story, okay? So Prince Albert, soon to become Edward VII, took over strategic matters. And he took upon himself the removal of Bismarck in 1890 by certain manipulations of the Kaiser. He took upon himself the pitting of the Germans against the Russians, Tsar Nicholas versus Kaiser Wilhelm, who were cousins, who were of course related to the British monarchy. And Prince Albert and King Edward organized the Russo-Japanese War, and everything that led into World War I. And the United States under Woodrow Wilson, this is after the assassination of McKinley and the great environmentalist Teddy Roosevelt, whose environmentalism destroyed the development of the West. He set up a series of parks in the West, and somebody can say, well, aren't parks a good thing? You know, at some point you have to say, no, probably not. Not when they stand in the way of economic development. If we have parks that are clean, that are sectioned off, you know, most animals go extinct. We keep them alive. Extinction didn't begin with the human species. Drops in biodiversity didn't begin with the human species. It happened before there was a single human being. Every animal species goes extinct. The only ones who don't, who has the potential to not go extinct, is the human species. Because we're not limited to our biological form. Every animal goes extinct. They pollute everything. Follow a trail of elephants. All you get is elephant crap. Let the elephants loose and they'll destroy a forest. They strip down baobab trees. Animals don't know, nature isn't in an equilibrium, it's in disequilibrium. Human beings add a feature of positive economic, technological development. And so we expand the biodiversity. We expand the biomass of the planet. So what did Prince Albert and King Edward, who became King Edward VII? He organized World War I. What was it? It was nothing. It was a fight over nothing. It was a manipulation of the oligarchy, of the aristocracy of dying empires, the Ottoman Empire, in particular, to create a fight over the Ottoman Empire, religious and ethnic conflict, which is standard empire. The oligarchy has run the world for most of the time, with a few exceptions like the American Revolution. And so World War I brought great pessimism to the world's population. The idea became that scientific advance, cultural advance, would lead to no good. Human beings were crazy. Human beings were nothing but animals and have to be controlled. And so what we want is a nice planet with a limited number of people, a largely controlled population, and that has brainwashed a good section of the global population that gets to think about these things. Those who are too poor don't even get to think about it. They just try to survive. Why do poor families have a lot of children? It's the other way around. The poverty, if you have nobody to take care of you in your old age, if your income is miserably low, you produce a lot of, first of all, you have to produce a lot of children to produce a small number of children, because mortality rates are very high. So you have 8, 9, 10, 11 pregnancies to produce 5 or 6 children. And what are those children produced to do? They're supposed to take care of you in your old age, which may be 40 or 45, when you're no longer functional. You raise the standard of living and you actually raise the survival rate and the lifespan of the population. So by producing 3 children per family, you increase the population at a greater rate because they live longer, they're more productive, and you get an actual population increase. The only other time the oligarchy keeps poor people alive is when they want cheap labor. When they become too expensive, they kill them. They destroy them. They let them die of disease. They let them die of starvation. They work them to death ultimately. That's what a concentration camp is. A concentration camp is a slave labor camp where you underpay the labor force by underfeeding it so it works and dies. And the only issue of eugenics is to be able to do that without the concentration camp. What do we have in Greece today? We have a population that's being killed by economic policy, driven to suicide, leaving the country. That's the reality of the situation. And people have to face those truths. We've had a massive pessimism, very little scientific advance in the 20th century, fundamental science. I'll give you a good example of how this really works. One of the great scientists of the late 19th and 20th century was Albert Einstein. Now, interestingly enough, Einstein was considered senile for the last 20 to 30 years of his life by most physicists because he refused to accept the interpretation of quantum effects. Not quantum mechanics, but quantum effects. He refused the idea, which was a completely positivistic, empiricist idea, that you could not know anything about the real physical world. That all you had to do was accept the mathematical description of observations. And if that gave you effective predictions, then you couldn't ask what the reality was. This was what was known as quantum mechanics, pushed by people like Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, and so forth. Einstein argued against this over and over again. And his point wasn't that the quantum effects didn't occur. His point was that the human mind was capable of discovering the principles that made these seemingly anomalous effects happen. Now, actually, what Einstein was talking about was creativity. The human mind is, in a way, the human person is blocked from reality because we have to experience everything through our sense perception. And you have to get beyond the sense perception, outside of it, to use the anomalies and paradoxes of sense perception to provoke ideas that are unexperienced, but are creative ideas that are in accord with reality, because the human mind is driven to reality. From that standpoint, Einstein understood that creativity, what he calls intuition, hypothesis generation is a unique character of human creativity. The problem that Einstein had was he was unaware of what Vernadsky looked at in terms of life. What's an actual principle of life that is also progressive, developmental, which means that the universe itself has that quality, even the abiotic. Now let me give you a sense of what goes on and what has to be broken. Like on this Obama question. Obama's mustache is deserved. I don't care if 299 million Americans don't like it because it's not the right thing to do. That's how you end up with the kind of insanity that we have. I'll give you this is in the strange area of sophisticated science. Because at the end, today, many scientists are beginning to realize that Einstein may well have been right. That quantum theory is not a complete description of reality. Quantum mechanics does not account for a complete description of even the physical world, let alone the living and the creative. But I love this quote. As Einstein's influence waned, wars grew, with missionaries like Heisenberg and Pauli spreading the message among their own flocks. The Copenhagen interpretation became synonymous with quantum mechanics. When he was a student in the 1960s, John Clauser was often told that Einstein and Schrödinger had become senile, and their opinion on matters quantum could not be trusted. This gossip was repeated to me by a large number of well-known physicists from many different prestigious institutions. He recalled years after becoming the first to test Bell's inequality in 1972. In stark contrast, Bohr was deemed to possess almost supernatural powers of reasoning and intuition. Some have even suggested that while others needed to perform calculations, Bohr did not. Clauser recalled that during his student days, open inquiry into the wonders and peculiarities of quantum mechanics that went beyond the Copenhagen interpretation was virtually prohibited by the existence of various religious stigmas and social pressures that, taken together, amounted to an evangelical crusade against such thinking. But there were unbelievers ready to challenge the Copenhagen orthodoxy. In other words, there was mind control in the area of physical science. What was it? Social pressure, careers. Just as today, if you bring up the issue of ecology, of the environment as a real issue, you're told, no, you can't do that. And what's going on in the universities and the campuses, etc., in the country? A virtual mind control by social pressure, not anything else. That you can't discuss the flaws and the evil embedded in ecologism, which came from not the idea of cleaning the air, it came from the idea of reducing the human population, that the greatest form of pollution is human beings. And that's the kind of pessimism we live under. Einstein was an optimist, even though he was somewhat disappointed in the human species. He was an optimist in the sense that he believed the human mind could discover not hidden factors, but discover the underlying principles that created quantum effects. We've got to tell, the only thing that we have on our side is not numbers, it's not power, it's ideas. But true ideas. What Lyndon LaRouche has done with physical economics is provided the basis in understanding the way the human species develops and the way the human mind works. A tradition that begins with Plato and the idea of hypothesizing the higher hypothesis. It includes people like Kuza, who developed the idea of man as a co-creator in the microcosm as a reflection of the macrocosm. In Kepler, who discovered quantized phenomena. This is not new. Kepler's whole point is the orbital arrangement of the solar system is quantized. There's only certain orbits that are acceptable. We then begin to learn with Leibniz, Gauss, and others that the planet and the solar system are part of a universe as a whole. We didn't create the universe created us. The progressive development of the universe concluded with the development of the human species, or is manifested in the development of the human species as a creative force, as a creative power. And it's that which makes us a potentially immortal species. I'll give you, just to underline the point about Einstein versus these guys. And think about the enclosure of the human mind. It is wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is, Bohr would argue. Physics concerns what we can say about nature, nothing more. He believed that science had two goals: to extend the range of our experience and to reduce it to order, pure sense perception. What we call science, Einstein once said, has the sole purpose of determining what is. Physics for him is an attempt to grasp reality as it is, independent of observation. It is in this sense, he said, that we can speak of physical reality. The mind. Two different worldviews. Now, this culminated, and we don't have time to go over it now, in the 1927 Solvay Conference, where in fact, Einstein was isolated, Einstein and Schrodinger were isolated, and the declaration of quantum mechanics victory was declared. It was a pure political act. It was part of the pessimism of the post-World War I culture. That pessimism about the ability of scientific discovery to speak and to approximate the real world ever more, and control it, and to give us power to explore more of the universe. That pessimism is what lurks behind the destruction of civilization. We see the same thing in music, and people get the same kind of anger. The giving up classical music and classical poetry in the 20th century, arguing that short, popular songs are better than people, because it occupies their mind, as people like Theodore Adorno or Walter Benjamin did. And creating this idea of popular music, which is simple, uncreative, has developed a culture where we can't produce scientists. And at the same time, we have scientists who believe in the random quality of nature, the undevelopable, unknowable quality of nature. So we're producing scientists who can't appreciate classical culture. Einstein was driven, like many of these scientists were in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, by great classical music. He was a violinist. He played Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, and he understood what it meant as a creative power, as developing his own insights into the way the world worked. He said to Heisenberg said, my only rule of thumb is observation and measurement. And Einstein said, do you really believe that true science comes from mere observation? You're a fool. True science includes the development of critical hypotheses that are not embedded in experience, that come from the contradictions of experience, that come from the anomalies of experience. And therefore, we have to go further and further out to discover the principles that are governing things happening to us here on this planet. We know that the effects of galactic changes affect life on the planet, cloud formation, weather, solar phenomena. There's much that we don't know. If we stop scientific development now, then the universe is finished. The human beings are finished. And the only thing we can do is tell people the bloody truth, even if it offends their sensibilities. Better to be offended and have the opportunity to live than to live unoffended and capitulate to the death of human civilization. We need nuclear power. You want to feed 7 billion people? You want to salvage Africa? Then we're going to have to go from nuclear power to fusion power and beyond. We need a space program to begin to understand what's happening on the planet and to be able to go beyond the planet. We need to be able to uproot the skepticism of modern science and recognize that we can discover new physical principles that give us an understanding of quantum effects and a greater control over the most dense forms of energy known to us. And that's what Larouche is talking about. That's what we're beginning to understand in terms of the relationship between the non-living, the living, and the creative. And indeed, the only way to look at the non-living is from the standpoint of cognition and life. Because the only way to understand the abiotic is how could it possibly be part of life and part of creativity. You can take the abiotic world and build it up all you want. You never get life. The non-living will never give you life. Reductionism, like Bertrand Russell. What did Russell do? He tried to reduce human knowledge to a logical system and sense perception. And it failed, even though it's still being used. Because it was an attack on the human mind. It was an attack on the supremacy, the primacy of human creative powers, which is what makes us different. We have the potential in a certain way to be immortal, not in a religious sense, not in the sense of a soul that's a substance, but the human mind produces things that have effects on generations after the existence of the human individual. And you can know that while you're alive. If we put the United States on a path to true physical economic development, to respecting the national sovereignty of the development of other nations, if we salvage us from nuclear war, we will have done something that will reverberate, as Lincoln said, unto the last generation. If we don't do that, we're not much different than the chimpanzees in the zoo.